Hey everyone, this is Dr. Maples. We're going to continue our lecture on rural sociology. Now, in our last lecture, we left off by pointing out that poverty in rural areas originates from one of two areas, education or the job market. We can address one or the other, and we can change that area's poverty experiences. If we change neither, we continue the cyclical nature of poverty that just doesn't go away on its own. So what I want to do in today's lecture is just focus on education. I want to talk about education systems, and I also want to talk about some of the capital relationships that are missing in rural areas. Those are something, too, that I experienced very uniquely growing up as a kid, and it's something that now that I'm a professor, I can really appreciate how impactful they are. So I'll try and share a little bit about that. First, let's talk about the education system. Now, if we were to look at a map, we would understand that rural areas generally have the highest dropout rates, more or less, for a lot of the United States. And it's very sad. There are some urban areas that exceed the rural areas, but generally, overall, rural areas have really high dropout rates. And it's frustrating because it's partly a symptom of the resources of the area, and it's partly a limitation on the teachers that come in there. There is not a teacher out there that does this job for the money. It's because we value teaching people. It's because we value sharing our experiences with the future and trying to make a difference. So never believe that any of your high school teachers, elementary school teachers, and even your college professors do this for the money, because we don't. In fact, in my case, I could leave here today and get a six-figure income without any problem in Silicon Valley and be happy with that. But I love teaching, so I stay here. That said, we see that rural areas in eastern Kentucky is falling into this same experience. They generally get the worst qualified teachers, and it's not because they don't deserve them, but what generally happens is that the way that teaching hires people, it's about a year in advance. So right now, in October of 2020, they would be listing jobs for hiring that start in the fall of 2021. Colleges are doing that, high schools, elementary schools, everything, they would do that. And so they're hiring for the coming year, basically. And what generally tends to happen is the most qualified teachers are able to get first pick in the job market. This is kind of similar to something that we call queuing theory in sociology, if you're interested. But basically, the most qualified people are able to get the jobs that they want first. That means that if you have really good educational qualifications and you're very talented and good scores and licensure and all that, you generally are able to get the jobs in the areas first that you might want. And what ends up being left over time is the rural areas where maybe fewer people want to go. What I've seen as a professor at two different rural universities is we would get far fewer applicants because a lot of people just didn't want to live in rural areas. Nothing against them, but that also meant that we had a smaller pool to pick from. And it also meant that we didn't necessarily get the best candidates who really, really wanted to live in an urban area and would have been settling to live in a rural area. Likewise, there's other issues. There's pay issues because rural areas typically have fewer fewer supports for taxes because they have fewer businesses. There's fewer life options, things like living in a city, having retail opportunities may be an issue. And as such, we generally see that the best teachers go to other places. You do have exceptions. I'm an exception to that. I lived in a rural area as a kid, and I want to teach in a rural area, so that's why I'm here. I could teach at other places without any problem, but this is where I want to be, is teaching in a rural area. Likewise, too, we occasionally see people from a particular area, like Eastern Kentucky, wanting to come back to Eastern Kentucky to teach. In those cases, we can get some really great teachers. But otherwise, we often see that we're the last to be picked. It's kind of like we're playing some kind of ball game and we're picking from the gym class, and we're just sort of the last to get the people picked for our teaching squad. So as a result, rural areas typically have very high dropout rates. They have lower than the national average for graduating people, and it's a problem. And it's generational too. That's one of the big things about education issues, is that they don't go away on their own. And if you have them now, they're only going to get worse with time. Likewise too, as you get more and more generations that maybe turn away from education or don't want to get an education, it just increases with time. Having a parent that didn't graduate from high school increases your odds of not graduating from high school yourself. And that's kind of frustrating as someone who had a parent who didn't graduate from high school. That's something that is that we face in these rural areas. So we have to be realistic that we have to find a way to fund education more effectively than we do. And until then, we are not going to see a solution in this. Likewise, too, with education, we see a couple of other things impacted there. And these are forms of what we call capital. Now, in the broadest sense, if you're in an economics class or something like that, capital would be sort of a resource that you can spend. Well, that's kind of what we mean in terms of capital here. And there's three issues that we have issues with in capital in Appalachia. They come across human capital, social capital, and spatial capital. Let's go through each of those in detail. Human capital is what you're doing right now. It's self-investment. College is a good example of that. Job certifications, job trainings, experiences. These are the kinds of things that improve you on the job market. They make you a better candidate. They make you a better person. They give you more knowledge, for example. Human capital, however, in central Appalachia and lots of rural areas is actually very hard to improve. If you have a subpar school system, that means that outside of school, you're going to have to educate yourself, which students sometimes have to do that. In fact, that's something that we think about with my daughter, that she gets a lot more education above and beyond what she gets in the school system, because she has no trouble with that school work, and so she's just got more stuff that helps her learn, things that are a little ahead of where she is right now with the school. And that's good. It gives her a chance to self-enrich. Likewise, it teaches her the ability to work harder, to think about being self-involved in her work, and so forth. These are things that are often a problem in rural areas. Thinking back to when I was a kid, beyond my elementary school, there really wasn't a lot to do in terms of human capital investment. You didn't really have ways to invest in yourself beyond that. In fact, investment was often working harder in terms of, cutting down more trees or being involved in physical labor, cutting down tobacco as my brother did. But it's not something that you really have an opportunity to do beyond that. It's a big problem too, when your culture might actually reject the idea of getting education. That's an ongoing issue in central Appalachia as a whole, is that we often find people reject education. Why? Well, because it sometimes challenges what we are taught in our culture. And that's not a bad thing. I think that our culture should have the chance to stand up against these things. But nonetheless, this is something that people are often afraid of. They're afraid of sending their kids to these places. Also, though, their inability to have human capital may make it harder for them to go. For example, we might find that students could be less prepared for college when they did go, and that might make them at a higher risk to drop out. So human capital is a serious issue in Appalachia. That also interrelates too to social capital. Social capital, in its most simplest form, is understanding that sometimes you use networks to get jobs that you otherwise not have gotten. How many of you have maybe received a job because you knew the right person at the right time, whether that was a family member or a friend's family member? I can think of a couple of jobs that I got just because I knew the right person and they got me in the door. In fact, one of my cousins got me a job that changed my life, and it's the reason that you and I are having this conversation now. So that's a good example of social capital. The people that we know give us information, ideas, and more. The strange thing about social capital is it doesn't really work the same in rural areas. In urban areas, you might know lots of people. They would give you information for opportunities and more. But in rural areas, social capital networks are very small, and they don't interact with other areas. In fact, one of the things that we find is in a lot of central Appalachian rural areas, social capital networks usually extend about as far as your local church. You know the people at your church, and whatever resources they might be able to offer, you have access to. But beyond that, you don't really have much. In other cases, we see they go about as far as the county line. There's also a question, too, of what you're getting from those social capital networks. Today, I have social capital networks that could help get kids into college, that could help them apply for college, that could help them get scholarships and more if needed. But what if the social capital networks were what I had back home, which was getting into basic minimum wage style jobs, working at places that you probably didn't want to work? That's actually really about it. My social capital never really did anything for me when I was a kid because it didn't go very far. It didn't take me anywhere, too, that I really wanted to go. So the social capital networks are a problem. We can think about how those might limit opportunities. Finally, there's the spatial element of living in a rural area, and I've talked a little bit about this before. Imagine the value of living in an area where you had access to the Smithsonian and could learn from that resource on a regular basis. Now, trade that off with living in Powell County, and the Red River Museum is the only comparable thing that you have. Red River Museum is an awesome experience, and I think they're a group of amazing local scholars that are doing a great job of collecting information and scholarship that's helping protect the history of that area. But we also can't put them on the same level as the Smithsonian, nor would they put themselves on that level. It's just a different thing. So the amount of knowledge that you could get from those different experiences would have different impacts on your life. You know, it's really intriguing because one of the big things that we've seen about Spatial Capital in places like Lee County, Kentucky, is that even though our education system there doesn't have a lot to offer, there's also just not a lot happening in the community in terms of self-enrichment. In fact, some of the most important self-enrichment there is now coming from outside the area. There are rock climbers in the community who have organized the ability to get teaching seminars into the local county high schools to teach them everything from coding to climbing to working on all sorts of different things, computers. So it's really interesting to see how the local resources are very limited, and really that need to network into other resources is really what would be helpful. And yet in rural areas, we tend to feel that sense of isolation. We feel that sense of social distance that we talk about in urban sociology and in our stratification lecture series. As such, growing up rural can really have a strange impact on your experiences, whether it shapes what you expect out of life, what you see as possible in life, or even what you might consider as possible. Think, too, about the idea of growing up in a very isolated area. Your world only is as big as the county line. Even though the internet exists, you may not fully grasp that there are opportunities far bigger than you could ever imagine. That certainly was the story for me. When I was 18 years old, the first time I really sat down and used a computer with Windows. So that was a thing for me. I used it to play mini golf, strangely enough, but we'll leave that conversation for another day. So that's where we're at. If we can choose to invest in education in rural counties, particularly in central Appalachia, we could create a lot of change. But it's difficult because there aren't tax dollars to support that. In fact, our education systems are largely supported through the tax dollars that are gained from property taxes. And in rural areas, the property is not worth much. As such, the schools don't get a lot of funding. So if we're going to change education in these areas, we're going to have to rethink our funding model. If we can't do that, then that means that we're going to have to change something else about that area, and that means changing the job market. In fact, that's going to be the target of our next and final lecture on rural sociology. If you have questions, if you have interest, you want to share your experiences growing up rural, you feel free to get in touch with me. I've got email, I've got course the discussion time too. If you want to drop in to chat on office hours, I'm here to do that. Otherwise, I will see you in our next lecture. Take care.